Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host and friend, Jed Hartley, son of a false prophet and former member of the International House of Prayer. Jed, it's good to be back, and if you had told me years ago when I was a kid that I would have a podcast about one of these little smoke bomb toys that I used to grow up and throw on the sidewalk and watch the smoke billow up, I would have laughed at you. What in the world could you talk about? And the fact that we're having to sit here as adult men and talk about this as an actual situation that is happening in churches, it's beyond me, but I have to say, out of all of the things that I have talked about on the podcast, this is weird, but there's a line of weird things that we can talk about, and this isn't the weirdest, but it is very strange.
Yeah. I think that there's nothing as disconnected between my perception of Christian persecution when I was a kid versus these manifestations of so-called Christian persecution that we're seeing today. I mean, I really thought, the world was going to end in fire, and that people were going to come with guns to kill me for being Christian. And instead we have smoke bombs, which for people who do not know what we're referencing, recently Sean Feucht had and we've talked about Sean Feucht several times on this podcast, but Sean Feucht had a crusade campaign that was up north in Canada, and he was speaking at several different churches and holding different worship events. And the long and short of it is that the Canadian government, the local governments, there was a lot of protests and a lot of backlash towards having him host these events, and a lot of his events were canceled. He lost permits to do these certain events and had to scramble. And then in one of the events that he did end up holding, because he was able to find different venues last minute, someone released a smoke bomb that's like the gender reveal smoke bombs that are all pink or blue, but then in this case that it was pink, and was protesting him and protesting his sort of Dominionist Christianity, specifically his sort of right-wing anti-LGBTQ and just Christian Dominionism in general. And so there was a lot of protests that were being held. And there was a tweet that he sent out about basically him being persecuted in the church that he was performing at was firebombed. That was the term that he used for it, was firebombed, when instead it was a gender reveal smoke bomb. And he took a picture of it. He was holding the smoke bomb in his hand and stuff. So it's so silly. There's people who I understand people are similar people to me, and individuals who have sort of spoken up against Christian dominionists like Sean Feucht in the past, and New Apostolic Reformation pastors like Feucht are being oh, look, he lied. It wasn't a firebomb. It was just a smoke bomb. But part of me is also yeah, this is just what they do. This is just par for the course, is this idea of any sort of type of persecution. And, someone did release a smoke bomb and disrupting his worship service. And of course he was going to just absolutely eat all of that up, because any sense in which you can write a narrative in which Feucht is not the aggressor, is not the part of the sort of dominion class that is taking control and domination over individuals, and instead is the persecuting, the persecute. Anytime they can kind of like flip that narrative, you better believe that that's going to happen. So I thought that it was just a wonderful foray into a topic that is very prevalent in right-wing Christianity, which is this martyr complex of this belief that, we all Christians are being persecuted presently, and to be a Christian, you must be persecuted. And so I thought we could dive into that today.
I'm actually glad you did, because I don't think this is something that I have brought up much on the podcast, the ties of martyrdom to cults. Mm-hmm. It's not unique to Brandhamism or IHOP or NAR. You can look back as far as you want. Any group of people who rise up and are oppressing and manipulating their people, whenever anybody in opposition to the oppression comes forward, they act as though they're a martyr. And the sad truth of it is, whenever that happens, the people who are inside, even though the people trying to help them are pushing for their release, the fact that they're being presented as martyrs, that solidifies their involvement in whatever is the sect. They believe, okay, this is the outside. Cult leaders will often say that we have the great persecution that's coming. They'll basically manipulate people to believe that in the Branham message, we called it the squeeze. The squeeze is coming. The government's going to close in on us. They're going to shut our doors. Every cult has this type of theme. And what it does is it prepares the individual who's being manipulated to expect that there will be outside opposition to them being in a destructive cult, because without question, there always will be. However, if you trace the lineage back from the NAR, as we have done, through various figures like Mike Bickle, like Bill Johnson, all the way back to the Latter Rain and its ideology, a lot of people miss this, because when you go all the way back as far as Christian identity, you find that there was one book that was heavily used, and that was the Anti-Semitic Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which we've mentioned.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Henry Ford was publishing this through his Dearborn Independent. You have people like Gerald Burton Winrod, who was distributing it all throughout fundamentalist religion. He was working closely with people like Charles Fuller Foundation, the same exact Fuller Theological Seminary that C. Peter Wagner came from. They're all pushing this anti-Semitic book, but there's another book they're pushing too. The Christian Identity Movement, if you understand the concept behind it, it's built on British Israelism. It's the idea that United States and Great Britain are the direct descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Well, with this comes the notion that the Americas and Great Britain are destined, predetermined to be some sort of a spiritual elite realm that, it basically is the kingdom, right? That's why they're pushing for the kingdom. And the idea of Christian identity was that the false Jews were coming in to take it, but they were coming in with the idea that it was the false Jews working with Roman Catholicism. That's why you see they were vastly, strongly against Roman Catholicism. And so what did they do? They chose the other book, which is widely, we talked about it in Branhamism. In fact, I think if you bought the Branham collection of literature, it came packaged in that, if I remember correctly. And that's Foxe's Book of the Martyrs, which, if you read this and you understand what it is, yes, it has some historical fact, but it is heavily, heavily swayed against Catholicism. In the lineage of martyrs that they list, they ignore every Catholic martyr that is in the history, because they want to make the argument in the book that all of the martyrs were against Roman Catholicism, and that Roman Catholicism developed as this separate entity. And because of that separation, because of that ignorance of history, you find that all of the white supremacy groups, the Christian identity groups, Branhamism, Latter Rain, they all go back to this book as here's a history of our martyrdom, and we today are being presented as martyrs for all of the political opposition that is happening in the United States?
I was just looking this up right now because I had a sort of canonical text in a canonical martyr text that I read and that people in IHOP read. It was huge within our sort of circle, especially young. Like, I remember this was one of the first books that I myself read sort of prompted, other than the Bible and some books by Ted Decker, a Christian author, was the Jesus Freak book by DC Talk that had, it was a book of a historical account of martyrs and people who had been martyred for the sake of Christianity. And I remember it being like there was a lot of martyrs at the hands of Roman Catholics. And so I when you were talking about the Foxe book Martyr, I tried to look it up real quick. I don't know if I'm sure if I had those two books that there would be a lot of overlap in between the narratives that they were talking about. I'm sure the Jesus Freak book was heavily influenced by that. But that's really interesting that has remained a theme of like the sort of Latter Rain communities, that there are these canonical texts about martyrdom. And when you were talking about how this is true of all, a lot of cults, and not just sort of the New Apostolic Reformation cults, I was thinking of I always forget that, but the Jonestown. I was thinking of the Jonestown and have you ever listened to the audio from the Jonestown before? You could probably put this more into context than me, so fill in and help me correct the story if I'm wrong. But there's a sort of audio recording of a lot of the leaders of Jonestown and Jim Jones, like talking right before they commit suicide, mass suicide, and they have like forcibly have the children drink the Kool-Aid, where I might be mixing up stories, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But one thing that I remember is there's this sort of idea. You have this sort of martyr complex that's being like, the police are coming after, or like the other is coming to like take us away and attack us, and because of the things that we believe. And it's so interesting because in that situation, if you were a cult member within the Jonestown community and you had not, sexually assaulted someone, there was obviously a lot of like criminal activity that was going on in there. But if you were just a member of that, the only thing that you should have been afraid of was your own community and Jim Jones and the community members. I mean, the individuals who were telling these stories were the ones who they themselves were what was threatening. I mean, it's sort of this self-inflicted wound, and it gives like an example of like who killed the Jonestown people. The Jonestown people. Like that was what the threat was. But yet this, I think the martyrdom mentality in cults allow people to, or it keeps people insulated within these cults, because there's this perceived reality that some of the oppression that they feel and oppression that doesn't exist is like being perpetrated against them, or would be perpetrated against them, or is going to be perpetrated against them. And so now there's this sort of like us versus them, and it further works to insulate a community and terrify them. And it's sort of the like, well, if my life is going to be taken anyway, I might more freely give it. And I think that the Jonestown Massacre is a great example of this, that they were so afraid of the persecution coming externally that they killed themselves. Like, what a great representation and a horrific representation of the ultimate end of some of this martyr mentality.
I don't think we've ever talked about this, you and I. I know that we've talked about it in the Revival History series with Charles, but you actually hit one of the main points I wanted to get to before I was going to get to it. I'll go there now, but the Jonestown Massacre was more related to this than you might think. And there is a connection. Everybody pretty much now is aware of the connection to Brandhamism, but they're not aware of why the Jonestown Massacre. I have listened to, they're called the death tapes. I've listened to the death tapes.
Oh, right.
I'm actually working with the Jonestown Foundation because we're piecing together all of the history that all of these organizations have covered up as it relates to Jim Jones and Jonestown. So let's go there. Let's give a brief history, because the martyrdom there is very closely tied to the martyrdom foundation that Sean Feucht's religion is built on. So what happened was the Latter Rain movement caused this great schism in Pentecostalism. The Assemblies of God first, I believe they were first, began to realize that this hierarchical structure of the what's called the fivefold ministry, what they did was they took the biblical terms for apostle, prophet, teacher, etc., and they created it as a hierarchy doctrine, not in the biblical way. So whenever you hear these people saying, but the fivefold ministry is in the Bible, yes, but not in the way Latter Rain presented it. It wasn't a hierarchy with an apostle at the top. They created that structure. Assemblies of God saw that this was not only heretical, but it was enabling people to come into the ministry who had no theological backing or sound doctrine or history. Basically, the laying on of hands could introduce a new minister who might be a predator. And so they said, we don't want this. We're disconnecting ourselves completely from this heresy called the New Order of the Latter Rain. Well, that caused a schism right down Pentecostalism, and interestingly, right down the middle of Jim Jones, the church he was attending and he was becoming a pastor in.
Oh, okay.
So, and I've got this history on the website, or you can go to jonestown.sdsu.edu and you can find this history. His church took the Latter Rain side of the split, not the Assembly's side of the split. And the state of Indiana became a rogue state in the Assemblies of God, in that they were allowing the Latter Rain and defending it, while the whole rest of the assemblies was sanctioning it. Jones, because of this, he joined what became known as the Independent Assemblies of God. It was the faction that broke off. And that faction had leadership in Chicago, Illinois. His name was Joseph Matson Bozay. He was one of Brandham's many partners. Matson Bozay ordained him into the independent assemblies, and Joseph Matson Bozay sent letters, you can find them on our website, connecting and introducing Branham to Jones, Jones to Branham, and essentially setting up Jones to be a new leader after this faction had split off, because they needed new leadership. So Jones was becoming a leader in what is called the message, right? Well, Jones starts hosting Branham in multiple states, these big organized campaigns and conventions, etc. One of them is in Chicago. And Branham, rattling off his fear and doom and gloom, doomsday concepts, he uses the British Israelism doctrine, which allowed ministers to take passages from the Old Testament and say it is taught in shadow in the Old Testament and it applies to us today. And he says the book of Nahum is describing the destruction that is coming to Nineveh, but also it is directly describing Outer Drive in Chicago. We've talked about this. So Jones began to fear that there was this impending doom, this basically everybody who's in this area is going to become martyrs. And Branham started saying what would happen is there would be atomic bombs that would go from Chicago all the way to Indiana. Well, that's where Jones is at, right? He's right. People's Temple's right there in Indianapolis. So early on, Jones goes to, what was it? I think it was Argentina first seeking to escape all of this. And then after a few years, he realizes, well, the atomic bomb hasn't hit. So he comes back and goes back a second time. And that's what sets up the scenario that you're talking about. But it was the Doomsday, the coming martyrdom that Branham had predicted. And Jones himself began insanely predicting some of these things. This martyrdom is what drove them into South America, and eventually it became overtly political. You may not know this, but they had this like radio station where Jones is talking about the current news and the impending doom, gloom, all of the. Basically what he's doing is he believes he is watching Branham's prophecies come to fulfillment right there in South America, where the communists are invading everything Branham was saying. And the reason why all of this is important is because early in my research, in fact, what drove me to a large portion of my research, as I was listening to the death tapes and listening to the sermons of Jones, I began to hear Brandhamism in it. And that's what connected it all together for me.
That makes a lot of sense. It's also fun because I'll be talking about this with you and I forget that I'm talking to one of the best historians who has studied all of this. So it is really nice to have that sort of concrete background behind what I kind of, because I had also listened to the death tapes and had picked up similar on that, like, man, because I remember listening to the death tapes before I even stumbled into your research. Like I listened to it a long time ago. And I found certain phrases and just like some of the rhetoric was very eerily similar to some of the IHOP stuff, especially some of the like Bob Jones IHOP stuff. And some of that early 80s and 90s rhetoric where it was like there's the sort of Dominionism Christianity that is a little bit more like, I don't want to say positive because it obviously is very dangerous and scary, but it's more optimistic because it's like the Bethel is all kingdom here and now, and it's like this is our domain and we are going to bring it in, and so it's less like doom and gloom and the world is going to end because it's like we are going to take control of it. I think Feucht is a good example of like playing both sides of that. He both is like the dominionist of like we're going to take it over and make this our world, but then on the other end he also is like, but the woke left commies are going to take every child and turn them transgender, or, you know, whatever the fear mongering is, or like depending on what I will say that it does feel a little bit different now because now it's more into grounded in like at least for the sort of IHOP community, it's more grounded in like contemporary politics, where in the 80s and 90s it was more eschatological, like end times, apocalyptic, like this is going to the end of all humankind and civilization. And I remember hearing, I mean, it was so many of my like early memories of Bob Jones and of this community was formed by this sort of impending doom that was being sort of embraced within our community in a way that was like, we really believe now I don't know, some of the people who are like they talk about impending doom and stuff like that, but I don't know if they believe it or they don't believe it, but like we believed it. We had I don't know if I've told this story before, but have I told the story of what happened during Y2K with me and my family?
No.
Okay. So you know, Y2K is coming up, and I was born in 91, so I was 8 when this was or I had just turned 9 or something, and I remember there was this sort of really impended, because there was the only time that there was sort of overlap between the apocalyptic rhetoric of the community that I was in and sort of apocalyptic rhetoric of the larger community. Like, it wasn't just the Christian community that was like, hey, the world's going to end. It was also, news organizations were talking about like, oh, this everything might shut down. And like, we were stocking up on barrels of water, and we had food that was, non-perishable food that was shelf stable for 10 years and that we were putting in our basement, and all of which has gone to waste now, of course. But like it was, we also, my family with a couple other families bought a farm out in rural Missouri. And it was sort of like cousins of cousins had owned the farm. So it was sort of like within the family, and we were going to like go out to this farm. And this is where our sort of like doomsday, I don't know what we were thinking. It's not like my dad knew anything about farming or anything like that. Like, there's zero sense in which we would have actually been prepared for the end of the world. But that was this sort of idea, is that, okay, we got to be ready. And it wasn't necessarily that everyone was convinced that it was going to happen during Y2K, because that wasn't really what the prophets were saying in it. But it was just the sort of like, well, might as well be prepared. This is sort of a dry run at the very least for the end times. So anyway, we got all, and I remember it being like, this is one of my early childhood memories, or a period of time that I think that sticks in my head, where it was just like, I really thought that we were going to face the end of the world. But I was also a deeply unserious child. And so on the night of the Y2K, I was with my friend Sam Salyer, and I think that we were either at the farm or I can't remember whose house we were at, but we were all together. Like, several families had gotten together, and we were in the same house. And the kids, of course, went to bed before midnight. But I snuck out of bed with my friend Sam, and we went downstairs in the basement where the breaker was. I might have told this story before, but and we could hear people, and they were like counting down to midnight. And it was always this idea, like, when midnight strikes, is all the electricity and everything going to shut down? So the adults are upstairs counting down, and when they get to 0, we flipped all of the breakers in the house off, and I heard them screaming and everything like that. And we waited like 30 seconds and then flipped them all back on and ran upstairs. And like, for decades, my parents never knew what had happened. They thought there was some spiritual something had happened. They had no idea that it was us. But anyway, one of my very formative memories. But this idea, like, throughout my entire childhood, there was like, we were always preparing for an impending doom. And it very much painted my understanding of Christianity and just my understanding of the world in general. And I always felt this sense of like, I felt other in the world. I felt, because of my religion, I was different than the rest of the world. Only to like grow up and be like, what is it? 80% of all Americans are Christian in the United States. Like, I was a part of the vast majority of religion within it. But like, that wasn't the way that I felt and perceived the world around me.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the Latter Rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the new Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. So I've never told my Y2K story publicly either, and I'll tell it right now. So early in my years, this was before I had my IT business. I was doing hardware and networking IT, and we had clients that were in legal systems, medical systems. Some of the paralegals worked out of their house, and so I had to go to this house. And whenever the paralegal called us, she said, now you got to be careful. When you come to our house, you have to enter in through the back door. You'll have to go through a gate. But we have a dog, and don't go near the fence, which is kind of odd, right? So I walk up. I'm with my partner, and we're walking in. And as we walk through the fence, she walks us through, or not she, but her husband walked us through. He, as we're walking past these great big old dogs that look like grizzly bears, he smacks him in the face, right in the face with a newspaper or a board or something. And the dog's just lunging, like I can see the chains tightening as they're lunging at our faces. And I said, what's that for? And he said, well, you know what's fixing to happen, right? Y2K is about to happen, and I need these here because it's going to be every man for himself. And I was like, really? So walk a little bit further. We go around the house. The dude literally has a sniper's position in one of the trees. Wow. And I look up there and I said, you're not deer hunting in this neighborhood. We're right in the middle of a city neighborhood. You're not deer hunting here. No, that's for whenever it happens, when Y2K, the moment it happens, I'm going to be up there in my sniper's position and I'll be able to pick them off from. I'm like, really? So the kicker was, we walked into the basement. They had, at one point they had a remodeled basement, but they apparently built shelves around the entire perimeter of their basement, and floor to ceiling were canned goods. And I said, you guys sure like canned food, right? And I already knew at this point.
Right. You were playing dumb on purpose. Yeah.
So I get into the office of the paralegal, and I can't tell you how many times we were there and this was the case. Daystar TV is up on her screen as she's working continually, man. Daystar TV all day long. And wow. See, I was in the cult, so I didn't connect all of this at that point. But there are so many branching connections. Like, part of the reason I zoned out, as you were talking about Missouri is a hotbed for this stuff, man. Rural Missouri. So I mentioned this, I think, in my latest book, From Christian Identity to the NAR. But there was a national states' rights party which was breaking off to try to overtake Washington. The P.O. box for the headquarters just happened to be in Jeffersonville, Indiana, where William Branham lived, where I live now. Not many people know this. One of the leaders was, I mentioned Gerald Winrod earlier. His son Gordon was one of the directors of this organization. Gordon went down to, it was either Missouri or Arkansas, and there's this big Christian identity standoff right there. But the other key figure, there was not in Missouri, but right across the state lines in, what's the name of that city? There's a big,
Topeka?
It's called Christ of the Ozarks. There's this big Jesus statue.
Oh, yeah.
That was planted by Gerald L.K. Smith, who was a leader in this and connected to Roy Davis, who was Branham's mentor. All of this is connected. And especially if you go back to Missouri, you're going to find it was like Missouri and Arkansas was a hotbed for all of this. So the fact that IHOP KC developed from this, it's not surprising. The fact that Bob Jones is so tied to this, he may not have been directly even tied to Branhamism. I don't know yet. We don't know his past. But he's right there in the hotbed. So he was indirectly, at minimum, influenced by Branhamism. So all of this is connected, and they all were, this was a very militant thing. They were all preparing for the coming war because they were martyrs.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, so like, especially when you have roots in Christian identity movement, and like a lot of the rhetoric that led to sort of the fascism in Germany and this, it's so, to be the aggressors, to be have a lot of the rhetoric behind, because wasn't Winrod was the Jayhawk Nazi, right? So, and the KKK, like a lot of it, it's some of the fuel behind some of the most evil things that were going on in the world at the time. And yet this pervasive sense of they're coming for us, which I think it makes a little bit of sense, because I think that you have to have this sort of cognitive dissonance where you believe that you are being persecuted to validate the persecution that your community is doing unto other individuals. And like this, I think that that's a common trope with sort of any time you have individuals who are on these sort of persecution crusades where they're harming and literally, genocidal movements in the past have had this sort of same validation of like, it's actually us who are being oppressed, and it's because of this that we must do X, Y, and Z. But yeah, like it makes a lot of sense how that was sort of birthed, and it also makes a lot of sense how that was what was really festering within the community at the International House of Prayer. And one thing that I think with this is, when you are able to construct, when you're in a community that is a cult community, that is where the members of the community have a boogeyman, whether that's one individual or whether that's a community, whether it's the Jews or whether it's the whoever, like whatever is being villainized, whatever group is becoming the villain, it provides a way to disconnect the legitimate abuse and persecution that you might be feeling from the very leadership of the community that you're a part of. And it sort of takes the villain hat and it moves it to somewhere else, and it diminishes the abuse and the villainy that's going on within your own community. And I've seen this in family structures too. There's this sort of like external scapegoat that is used to displace the discontent of the group towards something else, so that those who are actually perpetrating abuse within the community or within the family or whatever structure it might be are not held accountable for the abuse that they're doing. So Mike Bickle and Bob Jones are not going to be held accountable for the abusive behaviors that they are doing, because their abuse, they contextualize it as just so trivial in the grand scheme of everything else that's going on. And I also think too, like, I remember being at IHOP and feeling like the world was going to end, and feeling like, oh man, there's so much anguish, there's so much discontent. And I myself felt like if you had asked me, is the world in a good place right now? I would have been like, no. Well, a lot of my own discontent was because I had an abusive father, and I had a abusive sort of community that I was growing up in, and I wasn't getting proper education. And there was a lot of symptoms of the central disease of growing up in a cult community that I was feeling. But instead of having the language and understanding of knowing where the source of that discontent comes from, I had to displace it on like it must be outside. And I think that this is what is happening not just cult communities but just sort of mainline Christianity too, is like, I think that there's a lot of discontent in, like, you know, it's getting harder for the poor, the lower class to find jobs and to own houses, and there's sort of a lot of real genuine, like, hey, turmoil that is growing, like the buying power of salary to homeowners. I'm going on a tiny bit of a tangent, but I will stop after a second. But in the last 20 years is like the median salary versus the median home, the disparity between that has like grown pretty exponentially over the last 20 years. And I think that there's a lot of other things where it's just like, you know, healthcare and different things. There's a lot of issues that are plaguing the American people that are problematic. But instead of addressing the symptoms of it, it's turned into this sort of spiritual warfare, at least within the communities that I grew up in, that externalizes it and talks about other forces and these sort of boogeymen. There's all these sort of boogeymen that are placed in there, where it keeps from like addressing the actual problem. Like, okay, we have people within our community who are sexually abusing young women in the community, but yet that's not going to be addressed within the community because there's the boogeyman that we have to face that are outside of it.
Exactly. And it's a boogeyman of conspiracy theories, basically. Right. You mentioned and asked the question, was Gerald Burton Winrod the Nazi guy? He was widely infamous as the Jayhawk Nazi, or the Kansas Hitler, because he had gone to Germany and had counsel with Hitler, and comes back with a ton of money and begins, after this, distributing this Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Well, one of the most interesting points of history as it intersects with Pentecostalism is that the Sunday after the Night of the Broken Glass, the Kristallnacht in Germany, when all the Jews were persecuted, the windows burst out, taken to the streets, etc. The Sunday after this, Amy Semple McPherson let Winrod speak at her church. Oh. And it's significant because the whole world is watching as this is happening, and she is making a public statement. We support this. Winrod was one of the strongest defenders against, or one of the strongest in opposition against the gold standard. So in today's world, we would laugh if we thought we were going to get rid of the gold standard, because that's how we standardize, that's how we measure how much money is worth. Well, before the gold standard, he was creating this conspiracy theory that this was an attempt by the false Jews to take over the economy of our country. And that was widely popular among the fundamentalists. So he's spreading the conspiracy theories. He's spreading this idea that we're about to be martyred by the Jews and the false Jews, he would say, and the Catholics who are Christian coming in and taking over our churches, our politics, our family structures, basically our 7 mountains. He said our 7 mountains are being threatened. He didn't use that phrase, but that's what he was saying. It became very popular among all of the early Pentecostals because of the connection to Amy Semple McPherson. So this began to develop, and Latter Rain was really, if you look at the doctrinal positions and the reasons why of those doctrines, it was basically a highly politicized version of the birth of Pentecostalism, rebirthed as a political movement. And
it's crazy now too, because so much of contemporary, so much of IHOP's contemporary and over the last 2 decades, a lot of this sort of victim mentality comes from like appropriation of Jewish oppression in the during like the Holocaust. Like this is a whole different subject, so I won't, maybe this is a topic of on its own day, but so much of this, the end times is coming, and so much of it was rooted in Christian Zionism, in specifically in context with like Harry Truman, like Bob Jones and Mike Bickle. So much of the prophecies and rhetoric that fueled the International House of Prayer were this sort of like, it was just basically rooted in like, look how the people of Israel were persecuted and the Jewish people were persecuted in the Holocaust and during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and it really was the sort of appropriation of that pain as if it was like us too, like the Christians were also persecuted in the Holocaust. And so like while not recognizing that the direct lineage of the sort of Pentecostal community that birthed or the offshoot of Pentecostal and the Latter Rain community that birthed the IHOP movement was like, some threads of it was directly involved in stirring up anti-Semitic rhetoric within the United States. And this disconnect, I always thought it was so weird because, you know, the roots were not in this very like, let's appreciate the Jewish people and let's appreciate, you know, like the persecution that they have experienced. It was we too, so as the like Jews were persecuted during the Holocaust, like so too we as Christians are going to be persecuted and continue to be persecuted. Never mind the ways in which Christianity was used to perpetuate that persecution. That is a whole different topic, but it's this whole idea of flipping the sort of abuser and abused in order to have this martyr complex to excuse and validate the most like radical ideals that you can fabricate, like the most radical beliefs that you can come up with. It's just using genuine persecution. The same with that Martyr book, you know, like the DC Talk one, which it's funny in a very bleak sense. Do you know about Michael Tate and what's been going on with him?
Yeah.
And so for people who don't know, and I don't know much about it, but the one of the lead vocalists of DC Talk has now come forward, and there's a lot of sexual abuse allegations. I think there's 8 different men who have come forward with abuse allegations against Michael Tate, and Michael Tate even confessed to several of them. And you know, to what extent all of that is I haven't really done a whole lot of research on it, but he was perpetuating a lot of this abuse, and it's a sort of tragic and bitter irony and bleakness to the fact that like this book that I was reading about the persecution of Christians was really just appropriating a lot of the like historical context in which Christians very genuinely were persecuted and were killed for being Christian. And it's taking all of those stories and sort of making it a present day reality and acting as if that is the contemporary politics. Like I remember thinking that it was going to be a thing. There are 2 things that I thought that I was going to have to encounter in my life growing up were quicksand. Like I thought that was going to be a big deal, that I was going to just suddenly be swallowed by quicksand just because of watching Princess Bride or something like that. And the other thing was that I thought that like there was going to be shooters that came to schools and were like, tell me if you're a Christian. And if I said I love Jesus, they would shoot me. Like, and I mentally prepared myself to be able to have the courage and bravery to tell them that I was a Christian, because I thought that was happening on a daily basis in the world that I grew up in. And it's just such a bitter and bleak irony that he wasn't the author of the book, but the way that it was sort of sold in this marketed as like this DC Talk Jesus Freak book, was actively abusing and sexually abusing individuals. And it shows this sort of like appropriating the pain and suffering of people groups and peoples of the past, as if it is the identity of the present, in order to sort of excuse extreme ideology and to excuse sort of some of this, or minimize some of the abusive behavior that these leaders were doing.
Well, and it's a one-sided martyrdom, right? So in the Christian circles, they're often opposed to science, especially if the science disagrees with whatever is the doctrine. You've got the flat earthers out there who disagree with many of the scientists that that can prove otherwise, right? People like Galileo. Galileo was persecuted. I think he was, if I remember right, he was condemned to life, imprisoned in his house arrest. And it's not limited to just a lot of these names might be mentioned in the anti-Catholic circles, but you have, what's a good example? Michael Servetus. Michael Servetus, who was put to death, executed by John Calvin. Servetus was a physician, a theologian, and there's a lot. That's a very complicated execution, but his medical discoveries, is not the primary reason he was executed, but the fact that he was a man of science kind of opposed this whole thing. So if you go down the path of who is a martyr, that door opens up everybody. You could find Hindu martyrs if you want to look hard enough. You can find Buddhist monks who were martyred, right? The claim to martyrdom is not unique, but what is unique for this foundation is the fact that if you trace it all the way back down to his lineage, Sean Feucht included, trace it all the way back to this Christian identity, where you end up is that they believed that the Catholics and the false Jews were invading, and they were teaching this manifested sons of God theology. God is going to rise up, this Joel's army. We've talked about this. That was deeply rooted in all of this. And Sean Feucht, what's the name of his book? He's got a book that he wrote with Andy Bird, I think. It's called The Culture of Revival. He says something to the effect, there's a new breed of Jesus lovers on the earth. They will be the manifested sons of God. If you study Feucht's theology, Bethel's theology, IHOP's theology, how they have shifted and separated, you've mentioned that it's no longer the impending doomsday, it's more about the Dominionism. And I've had this conversation with the John Wimber people too. There's a progression, layers upon layers, shifting away from Branhamism towards this. But where you end up is that Brandham taught this apocalyptic, pre-tribulation, raptured doomsday theology. But towards the end of his life, many people deified Brandham. People like T.L. Osborne said that William Branham was Jesus tabernacled in the flesh, or I can't remember his exact words. He even went so far as to say at Branham's memorial service, you're going to think I'm sacrilegious for saying this, but this was God coming again through Branham. Well, through cognitive dissonance, Branham's teaching rapture theology, and he's Jesus Christ, and or his message is Jesus Christ, which is what was widely believed by this movement. And then he dies. Well, how does this work? How do all these prophecies work? So through cognitive dissonance, they make them both merge. So two different opposing theologies begin to merge. Over time, it shifted to the kingdom theology, which Wimber taught, kingdom now theology, then it developed into the NAR's version. It's all the same roots, though, because if you trace manifested sons of God through all of these layers, you can find it everywhere. It's just the way that they represent these manifested sons of God, and the theology differs from layer to layer. But where it ends up, people like Sean Feucht, who you can't really even say that he's definitely not directly influenced by Branhamism. He's got that same foundation that everything that he believes is built upon.
You brought up the Culture of Revival book that Feucht wrote, and it piqued something in my memory, and I had to Google it to make sure. But so the authors of that are Bryant Brent, Sean Feucht, Andy Bird. Do you remember the I've told it a couple of different times, but there was that metaphor that was preached to me at one point about the apartment being on fire. You know, that metaphor of just like, okay, if your apartment's on fire, you're not going to knock on your neighbor's door. You're going to bust it down and bring them out, even if they're kicking and screaming because like it's on fire. And that was sort of the image that was given to me as a sort of tool of evangelism. That was Brian Brent and Annie Bird. Like that. This is like I'm just coming to. I'm just remembering who it was that spoke it, because that Annie Bird was there in Kona, Hawaii when I was in Kona, Hawaii, and that was his sort of message. And it's just like sort of clicking for me of this sort of that analogy of this sort of like, let's bust down the doors. And it's the fire. Like this is the idea. It's more of the martyrdom complex of like someone has lit the fire too. It's not, the fire isn't just amorphous, you know, and times. It's sort of like culture, community. Like the fire can be different things at different times, what it is, and it evolves via prophecy during this time. But it's this sort of zeal and radicalism that is like, we're not just doing this because we want to save people. We're not just doing this because we have the good news to share. It's not just good news. It's we are in danger. And everyone else is in danger. And if we don't, even if we're cracking noses and, you know, putting people in headlocks and abusing people physically to sort of get them out of this, it's because there's a greater sort of danger that's coming. And I think that's just such a perfect metaphor for what they're doing, except the fire isn't, except they're making up the fires. Like it's not real. It's so the bigger that you can make the fire, the bigger that you can pretend, and the more dangerous it is, the more life-threatening, the more you get to excuse the abusive behaviors that you have, and the way that you can, the tactics that you use to save these different peoples. Because this is the same thing with Feucht, is like, there's this crazy, I really don't understand even how it works. Like, I mean, I guess it's cognitive dissonance in it, and that's it. But like, there's this big idea of like, I'm just an innocent, I'm just trying to share the love of God, as if he wasn't like crusading and campaigning against all these different ideas and ideologies, whether it's, you know, Islamophobia, whether it's just xenophobia in general, whether it's, you know, about demonizing the immigrants, like he's explicitly, you know, on this sort of get the illegal immigrants, get all these illegals out of here. And let's not even get started about the LGBTQ community and how much they like demonize the LGBTQ community. And I just don't understand, even for people, like I know that there's people who listen to this who are against some of those things and are like, oh, I want the illegals out of my country, and I want, you know, LGBTQ to be criminalized or some, whatever, maybe not criminalized, but, you know, that you can't marry or whatever it is. But like, you can't be against people. You can't continue to be antagonistic. You can't have one of the most judgmental gospels that is being preached and then have this sort of like, what did I do? Oh, I'm just innocent. You know, like I am, oh, these people are coming after me. Of course, because you are like waging war with the identity of 90% of the population. Like, because like Feucht has like explicitly said that Democrats don't go to heaven. Like he is explicitly stated that, where like everybody is going to die and be tortured for all of eternity besides his like small group of people. And this is what I just don't understand. The same as I got the same rhetoric from Chris Falloton, where it was this sort of like, we're just trying to, why us? Why is there so much attention towards us and what we're doing? And like, why are you coming at? We're just trying to preach the love of God. And it's like, you have the most judgmental gospel of any group of Christians in the United States. Like it is apocalyptic. It is exclusive. It is political. It is judgmental. Like it is harsh. Sinners in the hands of an angry God type of punishment that deals with like those who are not saved. You can't preach that gospel and not be hated by people, because like it's a hateful gospel. It has so much judgment towards everybody who's different than you. And I hate this rhetoric, and I hate that it works. This is another thing too, of like, it's so silly, the Feucht holding up the smoke bomb and being like, we were firebombed in. It's because it's just like, you were not in danger. Okay, yeah, your worship service was disrupted, but it's gonna work. Like he's going to build, like he's gonna get more money because of it. And this is where I'm like, I don't know if it's the best strategy. I don't know how you combat sort of these things, because any sort of resistance against these people and these individuals kind of plays into their narrative of like, I'm being attacked. And this is the whole thing of like, this as well as I do. I'm trying to talk about Mike Bickle and how he abused people. And of course, this is a demonic attack against the end times prayer movement. And that I think at some point it doesn't work as well when it's like, no, you guys are abusers. And I think so. Like, I think with Feucht and with Bickle and all, like, no one, I think that the rhetoric should always be like, do not, here are all of the instances of abuse within their own community. And like, these are the things that they are doing. And continually people should be like reminding individuals about that. That is like my strategy of dealing with these individuals. But it is really, really hard to combat some of this because it just plays into their narrative of persecution.
I literally just had this conversation with a theologian we met for coffee. He's wanting to help people in the cult escape. Had the same exact conversation with him. The problem is not just the foundation that was laid. It's the fact that the way that the gospel was presented, while all other Christians see it as a gospel, this is what Jesus did for you, it's not what you do for him. That argument goes completely away with this type of religion we're talking about. It's instead a gospel of war. There is a war coming. We are the good people. We're the good guys. Mm-hmm. Everyone who's not part of our group is the bad guys. They're either working with the enemy or they're an innocent bystander who's doing nothing and therefore supporting the enemy. You have to, you get this us versus them mentality. So we need to conquer those mountains that those people are on. That's the concept that was created. That concept goes all the way back to Christian identity. Before that, it was the Klan, which this is also built upon. So all of these ideologies basically birthed this new thing that they called the gospel. And it wasn't the same gospel that other Christians hear. So whenever they use these phrases like, Jesus died on the cross for your sins, and they have various pieces of the gospel, what they're teaching isn't the gospel. And it's very hard to distinguish. So even if you go and try to attack it from a theological standpoint, you hit a brick wall every time, because the words that you're saying that are in the Bible, they have different meanings to the people who have been indoctrinated like this. So you hit this brick wall. And how do you stop it? That's the question we were discussing over coffee. It's very, very hard to stop when somebody's been literally brainwashed to believe two things are true at the same time, one of which is completely false.
Yeah, and any attack against their sort of belief just reaffirms the belief in general. Yeah, it becomes this very difficult, impossible situation. I will say, and this just as a sort of final thought, the one thing that I know the best way to combat the New Apostolic Reformation leaders is to attack their pocketbooks, because a lot of I do not think that Feucht would be in it if he was not making millions of dollars, because he has his it's so crazy how it's all the same. Build your sort of ministry, get this sort of fame and infamy, continue to build it, and then buy a bunch of properties and be a landlord like that. It's crazy how that's the arc of all of these different like that. Sean Feucht, Sean Bowles, my dad. This is just use your ministry to get a seed of money, and then use that money to buy property and be a landlord. Like that's just the game, the playbook for them. And as soon as it stops being profitable, as soon as they're not, if they're having to just live off of 30 grand a year while traveling around and speaking these things, the juice is not worth a squeeze. And this is something that happened with Feucht, was that he was invited. So all of these churches and venues were canceled on him, and then someone else was like, oh, you can come here and come to our place. And he was like, just as long as give us some bed to sleep on, and da-da-da-da-da. He shows up and the accommodations were not to his liking. And so he cancels on this group that, and this just happened. People should look at, this probably will come out in a little bit, but it's just so funny because it's make the bed uncomfortable, make it a little bit difficult. And these men are like, nah, I don't want to do this. I saw this with my dad too. It's as soon as they have to actually suffer for the sake of their gospel, they're out of there. And so if you truly think that it is true, then you should be, if Feucht really believed in his gospel, he should be able to do it without profiting off of it. And so, and the way to attacking, so the way to attack pocketbooks is to go after donors. And I think people should blast individuals who are donating to these groups. I think that's a much more effective way, is to be like, hey, here are these people who are donating to this. Here's the businesses that they run. Here's the sort of things. I think that's a much more, if people felt like they were going to be held accountable for funding these individuals, you would see that funding dry up. This is what happened at IHOP too, is it became a liability. And so the only time you've seen sort of some measure of accountability in this world was with Mike Bickle, which again, it's not nearly enough. And I hopefully there are going to be lawsuits and civil suits that take him for all of his worth financially. But that really is the way to fight back, because it genuinely is a money-making scheme, even for those who are in it for the love of the game in some respects, and love the power. It's still about money for them.
I've been thinking, how do I end this? And honestly, I think the best way is I'm going to quote Jim Jones as the end of this. This is Jim Jones before he left this movement. He said, "They won't tell you the truth because the Black Book is the easiest gravy train they've ever been on." And with that, thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me, John.
If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, you can read Weaponized Religion: From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.